Chapter 33. The front door opened, and Carlyle, Esme, and Emmett came through. They paused in the front hall, looking towards Rosalie, Alice, and Jasper, who were grouped together, sitting on the couch. Renesmee was wrapped tightly in a blanket in Rose's arms, a glowing angel, her brown eyes peering at the newcomers and capturing them in her gaze.
"Oh, my,"
breathed Esme, squeezing Carlyle's hand.
"Emmett,"
Rosalie said softly, standing up and clutching the baby to her chest. He lifted his eyes from Renesmee to look at her, struck by her luminous expression, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "Damn, I love that woman," he thought. "Hey, babe," he said, smiling broadly. Carlyle made a step towards the stairs, and then paused, looking back at Renesmee with a worried glance.
"Go,"
said Rosalie.
"She's fine. Go see Bella first."
Carlyle paused for one more second, and then sprinted up the stairs. He stopped quickly outside the door and knocked softly. "Come in," I said. He opened the door and came in quietly, closing it behind him. I stood up. His eyes went straight to Bella, and he looked at her for a long moment, evaluating the strength and speed of her heartbeat. Strong, fast. And then he walked to me and grabbed me in his arms. "Edward," he said, his voice strained. "I am so sorry I wasn't here. I never should have gone and left you to deal with this alone. I failed you, and I am so sorry." "Carlyle," I said quickly, pulling back in surprise. "You needed to go. No one could have anticipated this." "No," he said firmly. "No, I shouldn't have. We had no ultrasonic image, no reliable source to measure development. I never should have left the side of such a high-risk patient." I gripped his shoulder. "Carlyle, she needed that blood. You were the only one who could access it. You did what was absolutely necessary." He shook his head, unconvinced. Then his eyes strayed back to Bella. He went over and stood next to the operating table. He held the corner of the sheet in his hand and glanced at me. "May I?" he muttered. I shook my head mutely. Carlyle slowly pulled the sheet back, exposing Bella's damaged body. He stood still as his eyes swept over her, cataloguing each bruise, each wound. "Tell me everything that happened," he said softly. As I began to recount the events for Carlyle, his hands deftly moved over Bella. He started at her face, pulling her eyes open with his fingers, his brow furrowing slightly. Dilated, probably expected at this point. His fingers stroked gently over the mottled skin of her face, capillaries broken from the strain of screaming. His hands moved down to lightly touch the gash in her stomach. It was healing rapidly, still open in only a few places, the visible blood thick and congealed. He smoothed his hands over her rib cage, gently feeling each bone. At least 10 broken ribs, already starting to heal. His hands moved down over her hips. Probably a broken pelvis. When I told him about the broken spine, he paused and glanced up. "I think we should take an X-ray." I helped him place the machine over Bella's lower half, and he took several films. While I prepared them, he went back over to Bella, carefully lifting and inspecting each of her legs, and then finally covering her up with a sheet. I held up the films. Fractured coccyx and sacrum, fractured at L2 and L5. I felt sick. Carlyle came around to stand behind me and put a hand on my shoulder. "It will heal," he said softly. "Tell me about the transformation. Where did you start with the venom?" I glanced at him nervously. "Well, I injected it straight into her heart." He stared at me silently. "While you were gone, it occurred to me that the best course of action might be to inject the venom straight into the heart, so I prepared a syringe of my own venom. I meant to discuss it with you when you got back, but—" Carlyle stared at me for a moment longer, his expression slowly turning thunderstruck. Then he went over and stood over Bella's body, looking down silently, listening to the strength of her heart. "I'm sorry," I choked out. "Maybe it was the wrong thing to do. Maybe it was too much for her heart. Maybe that's why she isn't waking up." Carlyle whirled around, his eyes wide. "Sorry? Don't be sorry, Edward. It was brilliant, ingenious. Given the already weakened state of her heart, the trauma it endured during the birth." He stepped towards me, gripping my hand. "It was what saved her." He pulled me in, hugging me tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Edward. I couldn't have done it better if I had been here. You did everything right. You delivered the baby successfully and saved Bella. I'm in awe of you." My throat felt tight, and I shook my head, pulling away. "But why doesn't she wake up?" I whispered. Carlyle looked at Bella. "Her system has been through a lot. She is probably in shock. There's a lot of morphine still in her system. I can smell it in her blood. It was obviously well ahead of the venom. It might be a while before she regains consciousness." He patted my back. "It is better this way, for her, if it cuts out some of the hours of burning. She will be fine. Remember, Esme did not regain consciousness right away." And then his expression changed. The pain that crossed his features quickly echoed in mine as he remembered Esme's confused and agonized screams when she did regain consciousness. I closed my eyes, gripping my fists. "I'm sorry," he whispered. There was a light knock on the door, and Esme came in. She stared at Bella for a long moment, and then looked at Carlyle.
"I thought you might want to go downstairs and see Renesmee,"
she said softly. Carlyle shook his head briskly. "Yes, of course. I need to examine her and take her vitals. I'd like to get weight and height measurements as well." Esme reached up and placed a hand gently against Carlyle's cheek. He looked down at her.
"Before you do all that,"
she said gently,
"why don't you go down and simply meet your granddaughter?"
Carlyle's eyes widened slightly, hearing words he never dreamed he would. He reached up and pressed his hand to Esme's, turning his head and kissing her palm. He smiled quickly at me and then went out the door. Esme glanced at me and then moved straight over to Bella. Her hand swept over Bella's hair, then down to cradle her face. She leaned over and pressed her cheek to Bella's face.
"Thank God, Bella,"
she thought.
"My sweet daughter."
She closed her eyes and just breathed in and out for several minutes. I sat down on the chair I had pulled up next to Bella's bed. Finally, Esme stood up and walked around the table. She knelt down in front of me and took my hand.
"Your daughter is beautiful,"
she said. "I know," I said, smiling slightly. "Just like her mother."
"And her father,"
Esme said, touching my face gently. Her fingers brushed warm and soft over my cheek. Then her eyes grew serious.
"Edward, you need to see your baby. Spend some time with her."
My throat tightened, and I reached over to grip Bella's hand. For a moment, I looked through Rosa's eyes. She was watching Carlyle, who was holding the baby up on his shoulder, one arm cradling her to his body, the other stroking her small head. For the first time, I noticed the bronze curls that surrounded her head like a halo. "I can't, Esme," I choked out. "Bella needs me."
"I know she does, and so does Renesmee."
Esme held out her hand, and I took it. She grasped it tightly.
"Edward,"
she said, her voice steady.
"I know you are my superior in many things."
"Esme, no," I muttered.
"You have the gift of music, and a strength that I cannot even begin to touch."
I shook my head. She leaned close, eyes brilliant amber, holding mine.
"However, in the area of parenting, you don't hold a candle to me."
She raised her eyebrows, and I felt a small smile play on my lips. She went on, her voice soft.
I know that you have been thrust into parenthood in a very sudden, unexpected way, and I can understand how difficult it is for you. I can't imagine what you went through during the birth process and reviving Bella. I experienced only a fraction of your pain, and it was terrible.
She paused for a moment, her voice catching. Her hand squeezed mine even tighter.
And I know you are still worried about her now.
Then she stood up, taking a deep breath, releasing my hand.
But you are Renesmee's father. She needs you, and you need her. For the time being, Bella is resting comfortably, and I think you should start to get to know your daughter.
I stared at her, slightly shocked. I looked at Bella. I won't leave her, I whispered.
We'll bring the baby up to you,
she said, smiling gently. I took a deep breath, uncertain. What if Bella wakes up? I asked quietly. I don't want Renesmee to see that. I don't want her to have that memory in her mind.
We'll be waiting right outside, Edward. We're all here to help you get through this.
She looked at Bella.
Bella would want you to see her.
I looked at Bella's still face, and then back at Esme. A thrill of excitement shot through me. Okay, I said. Bring her up. Esme clapped her hands together.
Wonderful. We just need to get her away from your father first. We'll have to let him do a quick exam at least.
She rolled her eyes, smiling, and then walked briskly out. I looked over at Bella. Her hair was almost dry, tumbling over the table. I stood up and went over to her bag, pulling out her hairbrush. I moved back to the table and gently brushed her hair, carefully working through all the tangles until it was smooth. You look beautiful, sweetheart, as always. Carlyle put his head just inside the door, and I glanced up quickly. 22 inches, 7.5 pounds. Reflexes are great. Advanced, actually. I clamped the umbilical cord, although it seems to be healing quickly. Full set of teeth. She's extraordinary, to say the least. Oh, I breathed. I want to check her weight and height again in a few hours, considering her rate of development within the womb. I felt a chill. Carlyle, you don't think she will continue to develop at that rate? I'm not sure, Edward, he said softly, his brow furrowing. Then he smoothed his features. Don't worry about that right now. We will talk more later. Rosalie will be bringing her up in a moment to see you.
Are you ready to go upstairs and see Daddy?
I heard Rosalie say downstairs. Carlyle smiled and then disappeared. Emmett snorted. Daddy, please.
Well, he is her father,
Rosalie snapped. I don't know, Emmett mused. It's gonna take some getting used to. Edward, the dad. He laughed again.
What about Emmett the uncle?
Asked Alice. Oh, that's no problem, Emmett said, laughing loudly. I'm gonna be an excellent uncle, right, kiddo? He pretended to punch Renesmee in the arm. Rosalie slapped his arm away.
Stop it.
Ow, jeez. I wasn't going to hurt her, he muttered. Watch out for the mama bear. Quiet footsteps came up the stairs. There was a soft knock at the door, and Rosalie came in, cradling Renesmee. She glanced at Bella, and searing guilt took her by surprise.
I failed her when she needed me,
she thought miserably.
I promised to help, to be there for her.
It's okay, Rose, I said gently. Her eyes shot back to mine, and she nodded slightly, eyes strained. She came over, and I stood up. Renesmee gazed up at me. I put out my arms to take her, but suddenly felt awkward, unsure how to lift her from Rose's arms.
Sit down, Edward,
Rosalie said, laughing lightly. I sat down in the chair, pulling slightly away from Bella's bed, and she leaned down and placed Renesmee in my arms. She was wrapped in a soft blue blanket, and felt a little heavier than I remembered. Rose kissed her gently on the cheek. As she rose up, she paused, and then pressed her lips to my forehead.
"Thank you, Edward,"
she whispered.
"Thank you."
For what? I asked, surprised.
"For Renesmee, for Bella, for saving them both."
She straightened out, and with a last look at Bella, left the room. Renesmee watched her go.
"Rosalie,"
she thought. Then she turned back to me, her melted brown eyes wide and clear.
"Edward."
I ran a finger down her cheek. Her skin was smooth, firm, but pliant, less fragile than Bella's, and so warm, almost hot. "Hello, sweetheart," I said. "Hello, Renesmee." She blinked back at me, her eyes dancing around my face.
"Edward."
Her mind was filled with an image of me, my face aglow with wonder. Jacob was visible just behind me, bending over the table, the moment when I had lifted her from the womb. The memory was tinged with tenderness and relief.
"Edward,"
she thought, and then she recalled Rosalie's words.
"Daddy."
I pulled in a quick breath, and my throat grew tight.
"Daddy."
"That's right," I whispered, cupping her face with my hand. Then I moved my hand down and carefully unwrapped the blanket. Her skin almost glowed, a pure ivory. She wore only a diaper, which Rose must have put on her at some point. I gently curled my hand around her small foot, caressing it in my fingers, feeling each individual toe, impossibly small. I did the same with the other foot. 10 toes. Her legs were slightly bowed, with a couple of pudgy ridges. Her umbilical cord had a yellow cap on it, and it looked nearly already healed. When I ran a hand up her stomach, she squirmed a little. "Ticklish, are we?" I murmured, grinning slightly. She smiled back. "Look at those teeth." I put a finger in her mouth and ran my fingertip along the top of her teeth. They did not pierce my skin, but I could feel the sharp edge. She bit down with unexpected force. "Ow!" I said, laughing. I pulled my finger out, and she smiled again.
"Ow!"
she thought, her mind dancing with amusement at my expression. I slid my hand down her arms to her hands, feeling each slim finger. 10 fingers. I pressed my finger into her palm, and just like millions of other babies across the world did every day, her fingers reflexively grasped mine. As she gripped my finger, the heat of her skin radiated through my entire body, a sunburst of love and devotion. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Beautiful girl," I said softly. I pressed my cheek against hers. "Beautiful, just like your mother. You look just like her." I lifted her up to my shoulder, and she nuzzled into my neck. "You are my precious angel, Renesmee," I crooned. "My sweet, sweet little girl." I kissed her cheek several times, and then inhaled her scent. Sweet, strangely appealing, but not tempting. At least not tempting to a vampire with some control. I pushed that thought away for now. Her soft curls brushed against my skin, and I pressed my face into them. I remembered my fears before she was born. If someone like me could actually be a father, a parent. But having her here, holding her, it felt amazingly instinctive. I recalled words I had once spoken to Bella. "I have human instincts. They may be buried deep, but they're there." At the time, I had been fighting so hard against my vampiric instincts, it had seemed almost impossible to access the human ones. But Bella had freed that humanity from within me. She had shown me the tremendous happiness that could be gained from following my mortal impulses, and had helped me discover intimacy, tenderness, and romantic love. And now she had given me the gift of fatherhood, something else I thought I had left behind with my mortality, and I was both shocked and happy to find that being with Renesmee felt natural, good. "I love you so much," I said quietly, closing my eyes. relishing the feel of her small body against my chest and the sensation of her heart fluttering quickly against my skin. "I am so glad you are here." I stroked her silky curls with my hand. I was a little worried that my cool body might make her too cold, but the heat she radiated seemed to keep her body temperature up. Suddenly, her mind filled with an image of Bella, her face close, sweaty and ravaged, smiling weakly. I cringed, knowing it was Bella's face as Renesmee had seen her in the moments after her birth.
"Bella,"
she thought, her mind swelling with love and concern.
"Bella."
I sighed, and then lowered her down off my shoulder, propping her up on my leg in front of me, cradling her body with one hand and her head with another. "I know, sweetheart, I know. That's Mommy, and she will be with us soon, I promise." I leaned down and kissed her forehead. "She loves you so much, so much." I glanced behind Renesmee at Bella's sleeping form. "She risked everything for you, to give you life. Her love knows no bounds." I looked back at Renesmee and smiled, and was rewarded with a stunning smile in return. Then suddenly her expression changed. Her mouth stretched into a perfect O. I tensed, concerned, and then realized she was yawning. She was tired. She sleeps, like Bella. I slid her towards me, cradling her in my arm against my chest. I carefully tucked in the blanket around her. "Go to sleep, sweet Renesmee," I murmured, rocking her gently back and forth. "Go to sleep now, my little angel." She yawned again, her eyes slowly closing and opening. Without thinking about it, I began to sing to her, the same song my mother had sung to me in the hours before her death, the remembered song of childhood. "Sway to and fro in the twilight gray, this is the ferry for Shadow Town. It always sails at the end of the day, just as the darkness is closing down. Rest, little head, on my shoulder so, a sleepy kiss is the only fare. Drifting away from the world we go, baby and I in the rocking chair." As I sang, Renesmee watched me, transfixed. Her eyes would close and then open again, until finally she could hold them open no longer, their brown depths disappearing behind pale pink eyelids, her dark lashes resting against her ivory skin. As I sang the final words of the song, her thoughts began to blur. "Rock slow, more slow, in the dusky light. Silently lower the anchor down. Dear little passenger, say good night. We've reached the harbor of Shadow Town." Renesmee's breathing became even, and the beating of her heart began to slow. I leaned down and kissed her cheek. Then I reached out and took Bella's hand in mine. I looked between their sleeping faces as I held my whole world in my hands. "I love you," I whispered.